Oh, hi, weirdos. Dan Rossbach here, your lead discussant at the Weird Book Club. Today's an exciting day because we're attempting not one, but two things that have never been attempted before on this channel. Number one, this is my first ever collaborative review. So let me start by thanking Sean from Sean the Book Maniac, not only for inviting me to share my thoughts on the new Ocean Vuong novel, but for all that he's done to champion my channel and send so many lovely, urbane, and opinionated viewers my way. If you're somehow not subscribed to Sean already, your priorities are clearly not in order. Please use the link in the description box down below. Maybe even click that little bell alert thing as penance for your bookish indiscretions. Number two, this is my first attempt at reviewing a book that sadly didn't really work for me. Now I think that every booktuber with even an ounce of self-awareness has some idea in mind of what motivates them to sit down, record, edit, and engage with the teeming hordes of strangers on the internet. For me so far, that's been to talk about books that genuinely excite me, push me out of my comfort zone, stimulate my thinking to the point where I literally can't not talk about them. As someone who tends to be drawn towards books that are somewhat obscure, some might call them difficult works, I'd also be tickled. Yes, tickled. If one of my reviews inspired someone out there to check out an author that they otherwise might have written off. And so far this philosophy seems to be yielding great results. Contrary to popular wisdom about the quality of discourse in YouTube comment sections, the responses to my videos so far have been incredibly encouraging and thought-provoking. But before friendly forest creatures start perching on my shoulders and I break into song about universal love and harmony, I should make the obvious point that unfavorable criticism, discussions about writing that genuinely disturbed, angered, or disappointed you can be just as valuable as any rave review. In fact, the main strike against negative reviews, in my opinion, and this is coming from someone who has 2 small children, and thus very limited free time, is that they take way more effort to do well. Not only are you denied that wonderful dopamine hit of gushing about literature that you love, you're compelled as a thoughtful reader and critic to defend the bad book from your own worst knee-jerk reactions. Here what I'm talking about are common negative responses to art that essentially leave no further room for discussion. If publishing a review online is supposed to be a social gesture, invitation to the community at large to take part in an intellectually provocative discussion, these negative reactions are kind of the rhetorical equivalent of shouting over everyone else in the room with a megaphone. But Dan, what are these negative reactions you're referring to? Well, I'm glad you asked, anonymous off-camera spectator who will never be referred to again, because I'll be structuring today's review around them. Here are 3 mistakes I almost made in evaluating Ocean Vuong's new novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Number 1. Grading a book solely against the author's other works. One of the reasons I was so excited to start this novel in the first place is that I, like Sean and many other readers out there, absolutely loved Ocean Vuong's poetry collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds. Longtime followers of my channel may recall that I gave that book a sterling score of 5 out of 5 sick Jack Kerouac diss tracks. I can't recall a single poem in that collection that left me feeling unmoved. And his piece, Someday I'll Love Ocean Vuong, still tops my list of the most emotionally affecting literature I've ever read. And if your introduction to Vuong's writing was through Night Sky with Exit Wounds, it might be particularly challenging not to continuously measure On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous against it. There's even a poem in that collection with the exact same title. So to save on time, confusion, and general mouth strain, moving forward I'm just going to refer to these as Briefly Gorgeous the novel and Briefly Gorgeous the poem. So Briefly Gorgeous the novel actually shares a lot of thematic DNA with Night Sky with Exit Wounds. It addresses the traumas of the Vietnam War and how they've been passed down from generation to generation, the vulnerabilities involved in embracing one's queer identity, and then there's the stylistic similarities. Like his poetry, Briefly Gorgeous, the novel, is very image-dense. This was something that I absolutely loved in Night Sky with Exit Wounds. How symbols would keep getting shuffled and shifted as the narrator struggled to find a comparison that could capture these complex emotional truths. Then all the dreamy indecision would suddenly drop away, and Vuong would deliver these great, definitive, one-liner statements that just leave you feeling emotionally fucked, in a good way. Here's an example of how that works in Briefly Gorgeous, the poem. I'm going to read you 2 stanzas off of a screen over here, so that's why I'm looking awkwardly off to the side. He writes, "Say surrender, say alabaster, switchblade, honeysuckle, goldenrod, say autumn despite the green in your eyes, beauty despite daylight, say you'd kill for it, unbreakable dawn mounting in your throat, my thrashing beneath you, like a sparrow stunned with falling. And the next stanza, dusk, a blade of honey between our shadows, draining. So very quick, punchy, evocative. Now here's an example of how these symbolic shifts tend to work in Briefly Gorgeous the novel. And here, the main character of the novel is describing an odd encounter he has in Vietnam. He's walking through the streets of a city late at night and he encounters what almost seems to be like a street festival in the wee hours of the morning. And then he suddenly realizes that, in fact, this is almost like a wake or a viewing of the body. And for some reason, there are drag queens performing there. So he takes some time to explain a little bit more of the background behind that. In Saigon, the sound of music and children playing this late in the night is a sign of death, or rather a sign of community attempting to heal. It's through the drag performers' explosive outfits and gestures, their overdrawn faces and voices, their tabooed trespass of gender, that this relief through extravagant spectacle is manifest. As much as they are useful, paid, and empowered as a vital service in a society where to be queer is still a sin, the drag queens are, for as long as the dead lie in the open, an othered performance. Their presumed reliable fraudulence is what makes their presence to the mourners necessary, because grief at its worst is unreal, and it calls for a surreal response. The queens, in this way, are unicorns. Unicorns stamping in a graveyard. Now, in Vuong's poetry, these symbolic shifts are like the engine that drives the prose forward. They're literally inseparable from the action. Say surrender, say alabaster. Whereas in the novel, they feel more like speed bumps, slowing down the plot so Vuong can intricately analyze his own symbolism. And while I appreciate the content of these interpretations, the linkages between gender, performance, the process of grieving, I'm not sure that I really needed them so meticulously spoon-fed to me. And then suddenly, after all that explanation, we get one more image tossed off at us with, in my opinion, no real added effect. Drag queens are unicorns, stamping in a graveyard. As much as I appreciate the goth Lisa Frank vibes, I'm still left asking why that needed to be added on top of everything else. Now I have to credit Sean with coining the phrase image fatigue to describe this persistent why reaction to the prose in Vuong's novel. It's a phenomenon that stands out particularly when you compare it to his poetry, where everything just seems to glide along so effortlessly. But the paragraph of prose I just quoted, I think, illustrates that even when you examine his use of symbolism in Briefly Gorgeous, the novel, on its own merits, it still often lands with a thud, or a stamp, as the case may be. Number 2. Speculating on what a book should have been. This is actually one of my biggest pet peeves in criticism of any kind. Insisting that a work's greatest fault is that it's not something else. The characters should have done this instead of that. The author should have written this as a political satire instead of a romance. This, for me, is an act of supreme self-delusion. You believe you're delivering a review, but instead you're just kind of rambling on about an idea for a book that doesn't exist. In the few mixed or outright negative reviews of Briefly Gorgeous that I've encountered, I think many folks are kind of skirting dangerously close to that line. A lot of their critiques acknowledge that Vuong's novel is filled with these, let's call them uneasy dualities. It's got tons of biographically accurate details like a memoir, but it goes off on these strange flights of fancy like experimental fiction. A big chunk of the plot is about the main character's troubled, often abusive, but somehow still loving relationship with his family. And then another big chunk is about his first gay sexual relationship and how he copes with its tragic conclusion. Where things start to get a little bit sketchy for me is when people start suggesting that the real novel should have been the portion of the story or the style that they preferred over the other part. Instead of assuming that these dualities were a conscious artistic choice made by Vuong to achieve some sort of effect, they almost invent a scenario in which he intended to write a completely different book than the one that's been published. I guess my main point is that when a piece of literature is unpleasant or dissatisfying to you, it's easy to sort of wish it away and pretend that the world was always meant to be more in line with your personal aesthetic preferences. What's difficult, though I think more rewarding, is to engage with what the artist and the text are doing to you and why it's getting under your skin. So here's my bold, audacious claim about On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Ocean Vuong intended to write a messy novel. How can I tell? His narrator says so, explicitly, repeatedly. I don't know what I'm saying. I guess what I mean is that sometimes I don't know what or who we are. The black wren this morning on my windowsill, a charred pear. That meant nothing, but you have it now. And then there's another portion where he's explaining why he's traveling back to his hometown. And he says that he's waiting until everything blows over, the word over crossed out and replaced with up. So visually explicit markers of indecision. To criticize Briefly Gorgeous for being an uneven mishmash of ideas is like criticizing Frida Kahlo for being too surreal or Andy Warhol for being too derivative. That's like their whole deal. They never claim to be anything else. And far be it from me to discount a book because it's overstuffed or confusing. Those descriptors are equally applicable to 2666 by Roberto Bolaño or San Shui's Dialogues in Paradise, which, if you've watched my earlier reviews, you know that those were some of my favorite reading experiences of the year so far. So why is it that Vuong's messy novel just didn't work for me? In addition to the image fatigue that I referred to earlier, I think that the main issue was that it just failed to deliver on its central premise. The framing device for this story is the narrator writing a letter to his mother, trying to fill in some of the gaps that have been carved out between them by history, language, racial and sexual identity. And yet I kept feeling that all we ever see of the mother in this story are her moments of trauma, episodes of mental illness, physical abuse, anger and confusion about her own sense of identity. She's complicated, yes, and often justified in her reactions. But rather than becoming a more fully realized character throughout the novel, she mostly remains this constant conduit of suffering. The same can be said of Trevor, the narrator's first love/lover, whose tragic story arc is shown to be utterly emotionally devastating to the main character. But as a reader, all we really know about him is he has an abusive father, issues with substance abuse, and a healthy dose of self-loathing about his sexual identity. Oh, and he really likes Green Apple Jolly Ranchers. Now perhaps you could read this as a statement in and of itself. Is Vuong implying that despite our deep desire for connection with our family and loved ones, there are these unsurpassable limits to empathy and intimacy? In a novel where so many other things are deeply described and analyzed, that core issue just didn't feel like it was sufficiently addressed. And to me, that left the entire artistic project feeling unfulfilled. Number 3. Leaving out the things that you liked. Anyone with a great deal of reading experience knows that our reactions to literature are almost always mixed, even to books that we ultimately loved. And if we can love something despite its flaws, isn't it equally plausible that we can dislike something despite its strengths? When you watch Sean's review, you'll hear him react to the style of the writing. And even in passages that ultimately frustrated him, he'll still acknowledge sentences that showcase Vuong's undeniable literary talent. So following that example, I wanted to point out some passages that I really appreciated because they acknowledge the complexity of gay sexuality with a degree of explicitness that most writers would shy away from. And while as an experienced gay man myself, none of this was a revelation to me, there was still a degree of honesty and authenticity there that I feel is sorely lacking in most popular romanticized queer fiction. And so I was really happy to see it represented here. So if sexually explicit things make you uncomfortable, I'll put a little timestamp right here. Just skip ahead to that point and you won't have to hear any of these dirty, dirty words. So these passages really address some of the issues of masculinity that play into a sexual relationship where one partner is the penetrator, the other the penetratee, being the quote-unquote top associated with being more masculine, more powerful, more in control. And the narrator discovers through having actual sexual experience that he is able to feel empowered as a bottom, as someone who is in effect permitting his partner to feel pleasure. So he says, "Because submission, I soon learned, was also a kind of power. To be inside of pleasure, Trevor needed me. I had a choice, a craft. Whether he ascends or falls depends upon my willingness to make room for him. For you cannot rise without having something to rise over. Submission does not require elevation in order to control. I lower myself. I put him in my mouth to the base and peer up at him. My eye is a place he might flourish. After a while, it is the cocksucker who moves, and he follows. When I sway this way, he swerves along. And I look up at him as if looking at a kite, his entire body tied to the teetering world of my head." So, maybe not the sexiest writing, but something that I think addresses very troubling notions of masculinity that still sort of plague the gay community even to this day. And then there's another portion where he's talking about the physical realities of being a bottom, and a fact that's regularly not acknowledged, especially in gay porn, unless it's there sort of as a fetish to emphasize the masculinity and endowment of the top. Is that bottoming really fucking hurts at first. But there is pleasure to be found in the process, especially as things start to get going and both partners find a shared rhythm with one another. So, in the novel, he says, after a while, the pain melted into a strange ache, a weightless numbness that swept through me like a new, even warmer season. The feeling brought on not by tenderness as from caress, but by the body having no choice but to accommodate pain by dulling it into an impossible, radiating pleasure. Getting fucked in the ass felt good, I learned, when you can outlast your own hurt. So those are my dirty, dirty thoughts about On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Thank you again so much to Sean for coordinating this whole collaborative process. I also want to put in a plug for Alex from What Page Were You On? He also had a really good, thoughtful, and somewhat mixed review of this novel. I think if you felt similarly about it to the way that Sean and I did, then you will find a lot of rich and thought-provoking critique in his video as well. And of course, if you have any thoughts, vehement disagreements, personal insults you'd like to share with me, please go ahead and share them in the comments section or connect with me on social media. Until next time, happy reading, weirdos.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. You've heard from Dan about his thoughts on Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. I really enjoyed the buddy read with him. This is the UK edition, and the pagination is the same. I am going to do a fairly close reading of one particular chapter, so I will give page references in case anybody's interested in following along. But before I get to that, because that's going to be the bulk of my review, is a close reading / rant on one particular chapter. I thought this book started out really powerfully, and by the end I absolutely hated it. And I hate to say that, because I loved Ocean Vuong's collection of short stories, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, with all my heart. And I really care about him. I like watching him on YouTube and hearing what he has to say. He's a big sweetie, and he is an amazing poet. He is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a novelist. So I'm not going to give you examples of his profound writing. There's quite a bit in here, especially in the first bit, but scattered throughout the text. The prose here, I have to say it, I'm sorry to make such a horrible pun, but the prose here is only briefly gorgeous, and it's got some of the worst writing. It was not ready to be published, people. I'm embarrassed for him that this was published. Way too much of this read like angsty journal entries that had not even been touched by an editor. That just disgusts me that publishers, because there's buzz about a writer, they rush things into print. It just makes me angry. The chapter that I want to rant about that turned this into a hate read for me, from which I never recovered, and I have now reread it just to make sure that I wasn't in a bad mood that week, because I finished reading this about 2 weeks ago. But I've reread it today, and I'm even angrier that this made it into print. They're not numbered chapters, but it's the chapter that begins on page 95. So let's start with positive. At the top of page 96, there's a beautiful sentence. What I felt then, however, was not desire, but the coiled charge of its possibility, a feeling that emitted, it seemed, its own gravity, holding me in place. That's beautiful. That could come right out of Ocean Vuong's poetry. So this is about him meeting his first boyfriend, Trevor, a white guy. Ocean Vuong's Vietnamese-American guy, and they're young, I don't remember, high school maybe. And this is basically about their first meeting. I could feel his eyes as I returned to my bike, and I wanted it, for his gaze to fix me to the world I felt only halfway inside it. That's a powerful line, and that speaks to a lot of what really works in this book. I don't think it's a novel, which is Ocean Vuong exploring his Asian American identity and coming to terms with being mixed race and dealing with homophobia and dealing with a whole bunch of stuff, and it's all there in that line. So, this is not all rant. The first thing that turned me off, and I had already started to get turned off by a lot by the time I got to this chapter, but what made me crinkle up my nose was they're lying on a roof, on a tin roof together, and suddenly he starts talking about the sun. The sun, now waning, must still be stronger somewhere west, I thought, like in Ohio, golden yet for some boy I'll never meet. I thought of that boy, how far from me he was, and still American. That's not bad writing, but it's just like, what is that doing there? He's lying with the guy that he's hoping they're going to start kissing or that they're going to become closer friends. He's yearning for something to happen between them, and this image of what the sun is also shining over Ohio. Okay, maybe I missed something, but hold that thought. And then there's a replication on page 100 of their conversations, and their conversations are inane. I'm sure this is a memoir that their real-life conversations at the age of whatever they were, 17, were inane, but what is this such inane dialogue doing in a novel? It's embarrassing. It doesn't add anything. Leave it out or jazz it up or something. There's a beautiful passage on page 104. I don't know if it was him or me who shifted, but the space between us grew thinner and thinner as the game roared on, and our upper arms grew moist, touched so lightly neither of us noticed it happening. And that there's an extended passage that I really liked. There's another powerful passage. I won't read them all to you because I want to keep this short, at the page 107 that I quite liked. And then this is the worst sex writing, perhaps aside from The Court Dancer, that I have read in years. So just listen to these sentences. Like, aren't you angry with me? Under the covers we made friction of each other and fiction of everything else. That's page 110. The next page, I drove my face into him as if into a climate. The autobiography of a season? Surfacing from the sheets, his face shone through the wet mask we made of our scavenge. And then there's a couple that are just, they're so bad, it's like he's at advertising slogan school, and these were the rejected ones. Page 112, in the darks, our facts lit us up, and our acts pinned us down. Like, that just makes me want to puke. Chapters earlier, there's a reference to him and Trevor lying on the ground, and they're bleeding, or somebody's bleeding, and it's like, why are they bleeding? It's not explained, and then finally it's explained here. And it's a little bit serious, but not really serious. And what was that suspense for? That didn't work. But the final phrase about that little anecdote, there's nothing here that much rises beyond the level of anecdote. Page 113, until the blood on our faces grabbed around our lips and stiffened us quiet. It's like, how did that make it into a published book? Then he goes on for half a page about seeing a print in a dollar store about a peach. What is that doing here? Like, okay, images are great, but like, it was just so stupid. Who cares? It's not about anything going on here. I won't read it to you. I don't have time. Trevor's penis is described as his heated length. And then, that's page 114, in the same page, he draws an analogy between Trevor's burly arms and a burned-out window frame from a house. It was October. It was a windy day in October, and the wind was making a lexicon of the leaves. Next page, this is Trevor, he cried skillfully in the dark. Like, this is awful. There's a thing about a moose losing its leg that, like, what the hell? Up to page 122, he and Trevor are riding their bikes, and their tires are swallowing the fat yellow lanes as we sped. This is so overwrought and overwritten, and it's just, there's still more good writing that comes later. Yes, intermittently, very, very briefly gorgeous, but there is so much cruddy writing. This book needed 72 more drafts. So, taking a step back from how shitty the writing is for so much of it, intelligent people can disagree about, I don't think it's a novel. It has no business calling itself a novel. It doesn't work as a memoir. Ocean Vuong is very weak at linking up the anecdotes, and he's straining with way too many images. Image fatigue, people, image fatigue. But perceptive readers can disagree about whether that works or doesn't. But I will go toe-to-toe with anybody who thinks that the writing here it's no good. And so, if the writing's no good, it's not a good book. And there is so much more, people. It's ranty because I'm newly enraged by the writing. Just give you two more very quick examples just to wrap up, just to make my case. From page 148, later in the book. The smell of sewage from the water plant stung my eyes just before the wind did with it what it does with the names of the dead, swept it behind me. I wrote in the margins, please stop. And finally, page 189 to close. This is his letter to his ma, and I think the framing device of a letter to his ma doesn't work, especially when he's recounting stuff about experiences they've had. So he's narrating things they did together, and it's a letter to her that you can't read. Again, people can disagree about that. But this last quote, page 189, you asked me what it's like to be a writer, and I'm giving you a mess, I know. But it's a mess, Ma. I'm not making this up. Well, I think that's all true. He wasn't making it up. There is no fiction here. There is a poet straining to write prose and failing badly. And it's a mess. And I am a distinct minority, and I respect anybody who liked a lot of things that they thought worked and I didn't, but I will die on my hill saying that this is one of the worst written books published in years. That's all. Thanks for watching.